On a rainy March day in 1883, a small group of people gathered in Highgate Cemetery in London. There were only 11 mourners. 11. For a man who claimed to speak for the billions of workers of the world, his exit was shockingly lonely. The man in the coffin was Karl Marx. Today, his name is synonymous with revolution, with the Soviet Union, with the Cold War, and with the very concept of class struggle. His massive stone head still stares out from his tomb, looking stern and wise. But if we leave the monument and travel back in time to a cramped two-room apartment in the slums of Soho in the 1850s, we find a different man. We don't find a hero, we find a disaster. The air in the apartment is thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. There is no furniture, it has all been pawned. On the floor, children are playing with broken toys. In the corner, a woman, a German baroness who gave up everything for love, is weeping silently. And at the desk, oblivious to the chaos, sits Karl Marx. He is writing about the surplus value of labour, while his own children are literally dying of malnutrition and lack of medicine just a few feet away. How does the man who wrote the manual on economic justice fail to put bread on his own table? Was he a victim of the capitalist system he hated, or was he a victim of his own colossal ego? Today on Deconstructing Minds, we perform a psychological autopsy on the father of communism.
We are going to look past the ideology to find a man who refused to work, who lived off the charity of a capitalist factory owner, and who sacrificed his own flesh and blood on the altar of his intellect. This is the story of a man who loved humanity in the abstract, but couldn't seem to care for the humans living in his own house. To deconstruct Marx, we must destroy the first myth, that he was a man of the people. Karl Marx was not a worker. He was born in Trier, Germany, into a comfortable upper-middle-class family. His father, Heinrich, was a successful lawyer who owned vineyards. Karl was a bourgeois from birth. From a young age, Marx displayed the traits of what psychologists call grandiosity. He was brilliant, charismatic, and terrifyingly arrogant. He didn't just want to participate in the world, he wanted to dominate it. His father, Heinrich, saw this early on. In a prophetic letter to his son, Heinrich wrote, "My heart swells with love for you, but also with fear. I fear that your heart is not as great as your mind. I fear you are governed by a demon." This Messiah complex defined his youth. As a university student in Bonn and Berlin, Marx was out of control. He wasn't a starving revolutionary, he was a spoiled spendthrift. He spent more money in a month than most families spent in a year. He joined drinking clubs, got into duels, and racked up massive debts that he expected his father to pay.
This established a lifelong pattern of financial infantilism. Marx believed that money was something that other people should provide for him so that he could pursue his genius. He never outgrew this. The tragedy deepened when he married Jenny von Westphalen. Jenny was the Queen of the Ball, a stunningly beautiful aristocrat from a prominent Prussian family. She could have married a duke or a diplomat. Instead, she chose the brilliant, fiery Karl. She believed in his genius. She gave up her title, her wealth, and her comfort to follow him into exile. Marx loved her, there is no doubt about that. But psychologically, he viewed her, and later his children, as extensions of self. They were supporting characters in the grand movie of his life. He dragged Jenny down from the palaces of Germany to the rat-infested slums of London, convinced that his work was so important that their suffering was a necessary sacrifice. He didn't see himself as a husband who needed to provide, he saw himself as a prophet who needed to be supported. And that delusion would cost his family everything. In the 1850s, the Marx family was living in a two-room flat on Dean Street in London. It was a hovel. A Prussian spy sent to monitor Marx reported back to his superiors not about revolution, but about filth. He wrote, "Everything is broken, tattered and torn. Thick dust covers everything. Sitting down is a dangerous business." It was here, amidst the stench and the poverty, that Marx's financial infantilism turned into a tragedy. He refused to take a clerk's job. He refused to tutor. He believed that his intellect was too precious to be sold for a wage. He told himself he was sacrificing for the cause, but in reality, he was sacrificing his children. Between 1850 and 1855, 3 of his children died. Guido, Francisca, and his beloved son Edgar all perished from conditions exacerbated by malnutrition and living in squalor. When little Francisca died, Marx didn't even have the money for a coffin. His wife, Jenny, had to beg a French neighbor for £2 just to bury her daughter. Psychologically, Marx dealt with this trauma through intellectual dissociation. Every day, while his wife wept over the empty cradles, Marx would walk to the British Museum reading room. There, surrounded by silence and books, he felt safe. He poured his grief, his rage, and his guilt into his writing. He was suffering from terrible physical ailments, painful boils, carbuncles, that covered his body, likely caused by stress, smoking, and bad hygiene. He famously wrote, "I hope the bourgeoisie will remember my carbuncles until their dying day." He wasn't writing Das Kapital out of cold academic interest. He was writing it out of revenge. He needed to believe that the system was to blame for his children's deaths, because the alternative, admitting that his own refusal to work had killed them, was too psychologically devastating to bear. The greatest critique of capitalism was written by a man who was desperately trying to externalize his own domestic failure. How did Marx survive at all? He survived because of Friedrich Engels. Engels is the ultimate paradox in this story. He was the son of a wealthy textile manufacturer. He was a capitalist. For decades, Engels worked at his father's factory in Manchester, managing the very exploitation he and Marx claimed to hate, just so he could send money to Marx. Psychologically, their relationship was a textbook case of codependency. Marx was the narcissistic genius who needed fuel. Engels was the enabler who kept the reality at bay. Marx constantly bombarded Engels with letters demanding money, £5 here, £10 there, often without even asking how Engels was. He treated his best friend as a human ATM. But the darkest secret of the Marx household wasn't money. It was Freddie Demuth. Living with the Marx family was Helene Demuth, Lenchen, a housekeeper who had been gifted to Jenny by her mother. She was essentially an unpaid servant. In 1851, while Jenny was travelling to beg for money and Marx was alone with Lenchen, she became pregnant. Karl Marx, the champion of the proletariat, had impregnated his own servant. This was a catastrophe. In Victorian London, this scandal would have destroyed his marriage and his political reputation. So, Marx did something that shatters his image as a man of truth. He turned to Engels. He demanded that Engels claim paternity of the child. Engels, loyal to the point of absurdity, agreed. He took the blame. The boy, Freddie Demuth, was sent away to foster care and grew up never knowing his true father. Marx never acknowledged him. He never gave him a penny. The man who wrote about exploitation exploited the most vulnerable woman in his house and then abandoned his own son to save his ego. This is the ultimate moral hypocrisy. It proves that for Marx, the image of the revolutionary was far more important than the reality of human decency. By the 1860s and 70s, the financial nightmare finally ended. Engels retired, sold his share in the factory, and settled a generous pension on Marx. For the first time in his life, Karl Marx was comfortable. He moved to a nice house, he went to health spas, he played the stock market, ironically with some success. But the tragedy of Marx's life is that the money came too late to save the people who mattered. His wife, Jenny, the aristocrat who had given up her life for him, was broken. Years of poverty, the death of her children, and the silent humiliation of living with her husband's illegitimate son had destroyed her health. She died of liver cancer in 1881.
When Jenny died, Engels looked at Marx and said, "The Moor is dead too." The Moor was Marx's nickname, and he was right. Without the woman who had been his emotional anchor and his first believer, Marx crumbled. He developed a severe cough, pleurisy, and depression. He spent his final months travelling alone, a ghost of his former self. He shaved off his legendary beard and hair, perhaps trying to shed the identity of the prophet that had cost him so much. And what about his masterpiece? He never finished it. Volume 1 of Capital was published in 1867, but for the next 16 years, Marx procrastinated. He obsessed over minor details, read endless reports, and started learning Russian instead of finishing volumes 2 and 3. Psychologically, this looks like perfectionist paralysis. Deep down, perhaps he feared that his theory didn't actually hold up against the changing reality of the 19th century. Or perhaps he realized that finishing the book wouldn't bring back his dead children. He left a mess of unorganized notes that poor Engels had to piece together after his death. The Bible of the working class was actually a patchwork of unfinished thoughts. Karl Marx died in his armchair on March 14, 1883. No dramatic last words, just a quiet stop. On Deconstructing Minds, our autopsy of Karl Marx leaves us with the ultimate warning about intellectuals. Marx proves that high intelligence does not equal high morality. In fact, it often serves as a tool to rationalize terrible behavior. He wrote about exploitation, yet he financially exploited his best friend and his family. He wrote about alienation, yet he alienated his own son, Freddie Demuth, leaving him to a life of working-class obscurity. He aimed to save the masses, but he couldn't save his own children from preventable deaths. Marx suffered from a specific form of abstract humanism. He loved the idea of the worker. He loved the concept of the revolution. But he had very little patience or empathy for the actual breathing human beings in his immediate orbit. His legacy is the ultimate projection of his psyche. The political systems built in his name, in the USSR, in China, in Cambodia, often replicated his personal flaws. They were systems that prioritized the grand idea over the individual human life. They were systems that were willing to sacrifice millions of children today for a utopian tomorrow that never arrived. We don't deconstruct Marx to say that capitalism is perfect. We deconstruct him to remind ourselves, never trust a philosopher who cannot run his own household. If a man claims he has the recipe to save the world, first look at his wife, look at his children, and look at his bank account. If those are in ruins, his map of the world is likely leading you off a cliff.